Widowed millionaire. Stunned seeing waitress lovingly feed his son as if she were her own. Call it fate or destiny, but their chance encounter at a small-town diner turns into something neither expected. Before we continue, consider my humble request to like and subscribe. It's completely free. The crayon snapped in Ethan's small hand, the broken pieces falling onto his dinosaur coloring book. Robert Harrington watched his 7-year-old son's face for any reaction, but Ethan simply reached for another crayon with the same empty expression he'd worn since his mother's funeral, 6 months ago. "Buddy, do you want me to sharpen that one for you?" Robert asked, his voice too bright. Ethan didn't look up, didn't nod, hadn't spoken a full sentence in public since Jennifer died. Robert's phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Winters, Ethan's therapist. "Consistent routines critical for progress. Consider regular activities outside home where pressure to speak is minimal." "Hey buddy, what if we try somewhere new for dinner tonight? Just you and me." Ethan's crayon paused briefly, the only sign he'd heard his father. An hour later, they sat in a vinyl booth at Maggie's Diner, a modest establishment with checkered tablecloths. Robert had chosen it precisely because it was ordinary, far from the upscale restaurants where staff treated Ethan with the awkward sympathy that made his son shrink further into himself. "Welcome to Maggie's." The waitress appeared beside their table, her voice warm but not overly cheerful. "I'm Laura. What can I get for you guys tonight?" Robert glanced at the menu. "I'll have the club sandwich, and he'll have—" He paused, giving Ethan the chance to order for himself, but his son kept his eyes fixed on the placemat. "He'll have the grilled cheese and apple slices, please." Laura nodded, her gaze lingering on Ethan without the usual adult impatience. "The grilled cheese here is my favorite too," she said, addressing him directly. "Extra cheese or regular?" Ethan didn't respond, but Laura waited an extra beat before smiling. "I'll put in for extra cheese. Every sandwich deserves to be its best self, right?" Robert's phone buzzed again, his executive assistant with an urgent question. "I need to take this, buddy. Just 2 minutes, okay?" He stepped toward the entrance. The call stretched to 10 minutes. When Robert finally returned, he stopped short at the sight before him. Laura was kneeling beside their table, not intrusively close to Ethan, but at his level. She was carefully cutting his grilled cheese into triangles, talking to him about how triangles always taste better than squares. What stunned Robert was Ethan's face. His son wasn't exactly smiling, but the frozen mask had softened. He was watching Laura's hands as she cut, and when she pushed the plate toward him, he picked up a triangle without hesitation. "Sorry about that," Robert said, sliding back into the booth. Laura stood, smoothing her apron. "No problem at all. We were just fixing up the sandwich geometry, weren't we?" She directed the question to Ethan, who didn't respond, but took another bite, the first time Robert had seen him eat without prompting in weeks. They returned the next Thursday and the Thursday after that. Maggie's Diner became their weekly ritual. Each visit, Laura remembered details about them, that Ethan preferred his apple slices fanned out, not stacked, that Robert took his coffee black until 6 p.m. and then switched to decaf. On their 4th visit, Robert stepped away for another call. When he returned, he froze in the entryway. Laura was sitting across from Ethan, building a small log cabin with French fries. As he watched, she offered a fry to Ethan, who carefully added it as a roof beam. His son's face held concentration that had been missing for months. More remarkable still, when Laura said something, Ethan nodded. A real response, small but undeniable. Robert felt a tangle of emotions. Gratitude, certainly, but also something like jealousy. This stranger had coaxed a response from Ethan that he had failed to achieve. And beneath that, a flicker of suspicion. The cynical part of him wondered why this waitress was taking such an interest in his son. "Mr. Harrington, do you have a moment?" Laura approached as Ethan put on his coat 3 weeks later. "Of course," Robert said. Laura glanced at Ethan, who was arranging the salt and pepper shakers. "I hope this isn't overstepping, but I made this for him. She pulled a small origami crane from her pocket. He was drawing birds in the margins of his placemat last week. Robert couldn't remember the last time someone had given Ethan a gift simply because they'd noticed something about him. That's very kind of you. It's nothing, really. Her smile was genuine but guarded. My daughter loved origami. I got pretty good at it. The past tense wasn't lost on Robert. Laura placed the paper crane near Ethan. This is for you. If you like it, maybe I can show you how to make one next time. Ethan didn't look up, but his hand moved to touch the crane's wing with one finger. On the drive home, Robert glanced in the rearview mirror. Ethan held the crane on his palm, studying it with intense focus. For the first time in months, his son seemed present rather than lost in grief's fog. That night, Robert noticed the origami crane placed carefully on Ethan's nightstand, next to the framed photo of Jennifer. The paper bird stood like a sentry beside his late wife's smiling face. His laptop glowed in the darkened office as he typed Laura and Maggie's Diner into the search bar. Nothing relevant appeared. On impulse, he texted his head of security. Need background check on Waitress at Maggie's Diner. First name Laura, late 30s, discreet and thorough. It felt like a betrayal of something fragile, but he needed to know. Too many people had tried to get close to him, or worse, to Ethan, because of their money. 2 days later, the information arrived in a sealed envelope. Robert waited until after Ethan's bedtime to open it. Laura Chen, 38, former pediatric nurse at Mercy General Hospital, the same hospital where Jennifer had received her treatments. She'd resigned 3 years ago, following an unexplained 6-month leave of absence. No criminal record, no social media presence. The connection to Mercy General couldn't be coincidence. Had she known Jennifer? The thought that she might be using his son's vulnerability made Robert's stomach turn. When they arrived at the diner that Thursday, Robert's jaw was tight with barely contained questions. Laura greeted them with her usual warm smile, though Robert detected shadows under her eyes. "The usual today?" she asked. Ethan pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and carefully unfolded it on the table. It was a drawing of the origami crane Laura had given him, rendered in blue crayon. Robert forced a smile. "That's great, buddy. Did you make that for Laura?" Ethan nodded, a small but clear response that would have thrilled Robert under different circumstances. When Laura brought their food, she noticed Ethan's drawing immediately. "Is that for me?" she asked, her voice soft with surprise. Ethan pushed the paper toward her without looking up. "Thank you." She accepted it carefully, as if it were made of glass. "I'll keep it at my station, if that's okay." When Ethan nodded again, Laura smiled, a real smile that reached her tired eyes. Robert couldn't reconcile this genuine moment with his suspicions. "Laura, could I speak with you privately before we leave today?" "Of course. I take my break at 7. At 7, Robert found Laura in the small courtyard behind the diner. "You used to work at Mercy General." Her coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. "Yes, I was a nurse there. The same hospital where my wife was treated before she died." Laura set her cup down carefully. "I didn't know that." "I find that hard to believe." The words came out harsher than he intended. "You take a special interest in my son, give him gifts, somehow get him to respond when no one else can, and it just happens you worked at the hospital where my wife died?" The color drained from Laura's face. "You investigated me." "Mr. Harrington, I had no idea who you were when you first came in." Her voice remained steady. "I noticed your son because I recognize that look, the one that says a child is carrying something too heavy." "And why would you recognize that?" Robert challenged. Laura was quiet for so long that he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she reached for the silver chain around her neck and pulled it from beneath her uniform. A small pendant dangled from it, a tiny silver handprint. "My daughter, Sophie, died 3 years ago. She was 5. The words were simple, devastating in their directness. "A medication error. She was in for a routine procedure, and someone administered the wrong dosage. Her fingers closed around the pendant. I was working in a different ward that day. By the time I got to her, it was too late. The courtyard seemed to tilt beneath Robert's feet. "I'm sorry," he said automatically. "After, I couldn't do it anymore, couldn't be around the hospital, so now I serve pancakes and grilled cheese instead of medication. It's simpler, usually safer. Except you took an interest in my son." Laura looked up, her eyes clear despite the pain etched in them. "I didn't choose to. But when you see a child drowning in the same grief that almost took you under, it's hard to just walk by." Robert sank onto the bench beside her, the anger draining from him. They sat in silence, two people who understood a loss that defied description. "Daddy?" Ethan's small voice broke the silence. He stood at the courtyard entrance, the hostess hovering anxiously behind him. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrington. He got upset when he couldn't find you," she explained. Robert held out his hand, and Ethan came to him. "It's okay, buddy. I was just talking with Laura." Ethan looked between them, his eyes lingering on Laura's face. "Hey there," she said gently. "I was just telling your dad how much I like your drawing. Would you like to learn how to make another origami animal next week?" Ethan nodded, his body relaxing slightly. "I think we should head home," Robert said. "Thank you, Laura, for everything." She understood what he meant. "See you next Thursday?" It was a question, not a statement. "Yes," Robert replied, "next Thursday." The drive home was quiet, but a different quality of silence than before. "Do you like going to Maggie's?" he asked. A pause, then, "Yes." The word was barely audible, but it was there. Robert gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Do you like Laura?" Ethan nodded, then added, "She doesn't make me talk." 5 words, more than Robert had heard from his son in public in months. He blinked back unexpected tears. "That's good, buddy. That's really good." 3 weeks later, Robert arrived home to find Mrs. Peterson, Ethan's nanny, in a state of panic. "Mr. Harrington, the school called. Ethan has a fever, and they can't reach you." Robert grabbed his phone. 3 missed calls from Oak Ridge Elementary. "My phone was off during the board meeting. Where is he now?" "That's just it, sir. Someone already picked him up." Mrs. Peterson twisted her hands. "The school said it was the emergency contact you added last month." Cold fear spread through Robert's chest. "What emergency contact?" Mrs. Peterson handed him a form with his signature at the bottom. There, listed as the 3rd emergency contact, was Laura Chen, a contact he had no memory of adding. His first instinct was fury. He dialed Laura's number, which he'd added to his contacts, but never used. She answered on the 2nd ring. "Robert, I was just about to call you." "Where is my son?" His voice was tight with controlled panic. "He's here with me, sleeping. The school called me when they couldn't reach you or Mrs. Peterson." She sounded bewildered by his tone. "Ethan asked for me," they said. "I'm sorry, I thought you knew. You added me to his emergency contacts." "I did no such thing." The words came out like ice, silence on the line. Then, "Robert, I have the form here. It has your signature. The school texted me a copy when I arrived to pick him up." "Text it to me, now." He hung up and paced the foyer. His phone pinged with an incoming message, the form with his signature at the bottom, except it wasn't quite right. The slant was off, the ending flourish too pronounced. A Hamisitvani. Another text arrived. "Ethan's fever is 101.3. I gave him children's Tylenol at 3:45. He's been sleeping since 4:10. My address is 1247 Elmwood Apartments, number 306. Door code is 743215592. You can come anytime. I'm sorry for any confusion." Robert grabbed his keys. "I'm going to get him." The Elmwood apartment stood in stark contrast to Robert's hillside mansion. He took the stairs 2 at a time to the 3rd floor. Laura opened the door immediately, her expression concerned and cautious. She wore jeans and a simple blue t-shirt rather than her diner uniform. "He's still sleeping," she said quietly, stepping back to let him in. "His fever's starting to come down." The apartment was small but tidy. Robert followed her to a spare bedroom where Ethan lay on a twin bed covered with a quilt. A cool cloth rested on his forehead, and a glass of water sat on the nightstand. Beside it, a digital thermometer and a bottle of children's Tylenol, with the dose carefully measured in a small cup. The practiced precision of a nurse, Robert thought. He sat on the edge of the bed and touched Ethan's warm cheek. "Robert," Laura said from the doorway, "I would never harm him. I thought you knew about the form." "The signature is forged," he said, his voice low to avoid waking Ethan. Laura's face paled. "That's impossible. Why would anyone—" She stopped, her expression changing. "Unless—" She went to the living room and returned with her phone. "Here, 3 weeks ago, Ethan asked if he could text you from my phone during my break. He said his game wasn't working on yours." She handed him the phone. There were several texts sent to Robert's number, mostly about a game Ethan had been playing. Nothing suspicious, but it would have given Ethan access to her full name and contact information, everything he would need to add her to the school form. "You think Ethan forged my signature?" Robert asked, disbelief evident. "I think he's a smart boy who really wanted a way to reach me if he needed to," Laura replied gently. "Children who've experienced trauma sometimes create safety nets for themselves." The clinical precision of her observation reminded Robert suddenly of her medical background. As he carried a still sleeping Ethan to the car, Robert realized what he'd seen in Laura's apartment. No photos on the walls, no toys in corners. The spare bedroom contained only the basics: bed, nightstand, lamp. A room that had been emptied of personality, of memory. The realization followed him home. Laura lived in an apartment as hollowed out as his mansion, just on a smaller scale, both of them existing in spaces that no longer held the children who should have filled them with noise and mess and life. The next morning, Ethan's fever was gone. When Robert asked him about the school form, his son looked down at his cereal, a flush spreading across his cheeks. "Ethan, did you put Laura's name on that form?" A small nod. "Why, buddy? You know that's not okay." Ethan pushed his spoon through the milk, creating tiny whirlpools. "What if something bad happens at school?" he finally whispered. "What if you can't come? What if Mrs. Peterson can't come?" The question broke Robert's heart. Of course his son would worry about losing another caregiver. Of course he would try to create backups, insurance policies against abandonment. "Laura makes things better," Ethan added, so quietly Robert almost missed it. That Thursday, when they arrived at Maggie's diner, Laura greeted them with her usual smile, though Robert noticed the careful distance she maintained. "The usual today?" she asked, her voice pleasant but professional. "Actually," Robert said, "I was hoping we could talk briefly first." When she returned, Robert had already helped Ethan settle with his coloring book. "Ethan, I need to speak with Laura privately for a minute. Is that okay?" His son nodded without looking up. They stepped to a quiet corner. Laura maintained a respectable distance, her order pad clutched like a shield. "I wanted to apologize properly," Robert began, "for doubting you, for investigating you without your knowledge, for my reaction when you helped Ethan when he was sick." Laura's posture softened slightly. "You were protecting your son. I understand that better than most." "Yes, but I was wrong about your intentions." Robert took a deep breath. "Ethan admitted he put your name on that form. He sees you as safe." A complex emotion crossed Laura's face. "I'm just a waitress who's been kind to your son. I'm not trying to be anything more." "I know, that's exactly why he trusts you." Robert glanced back at their booth, where Ethan was carefully selecting his next crayon. "And why I'm starting to as well." "I've been thinking," Robert continued, "Ethan's school is having a fall festival next Friday. He hasn't wanted to attend any school function since Jennifer died, but this morning he asked if we could go. He hesitated, then added, and he asked if you could come too. Surprise registered on Laura's face. Me? But that's a family event. I know, that's why I'm asking. Robert held her gaze. No expectations, just a friend joining us for an evening, someone Ethan trusts. Laura's fingers found the chain at her neck, an unconscious gesture. I don't know if that's appropriate. Probably not, Robert admitted, but very little about grief follows proper protocols. A small smile touched her lips. I'll think about it. Now, should we get back to your son before he reorganizes all my sugar packets? The school playground buzzed with activity. Orange and yellow streamers fluttered from the fence, and handmade paper lanterns cast warm glows as dusk settled. Robert stood near the ring toss, watching Ethan deliberate over which pumpkin to choose from the patch. He's been staring at that same pumpkin for 10 minutes, a voice said beside him. Laura approached, looking different outside the diner. She wore jeans and a rust-colored sweater, her hair pulled back with a simple clip. Sorry I'm late. The diner was short-staffed. You made it. That's what matters. Robert handed her a paper cup of cider. He's been asking when you'd arrive. They watched as Ethan finally selected a small, oddly shaped pumpkin and carefully placed it in the wagon they'd brought. He chose the one with a scar, Laura observed, not the perfect one. Robert hadn't noticed, but she was right. The pumpkin had a long, healed crack along one side. That seems significant. Kids often are without realizing it. She sipped her cider. Sophie used to pick the bruised apples at the market, said they needed to be chosen more than the others. It was the first time she'd mentioned her daughter by name to him. Robert felt the weight of that trust. Ethan spotted them and walked over, pulling the wagon behind him. Laura, you came. His voice was soft but clear. I promised, didn't I? She knelt to admire his pumpkin. Excellent choice, very distinguished looking. Ethan's mouth twitched with the ghost of a smile. It has a scar like Harry Potter. So it does. Laura glanced up at Robert, sharing his surprise at this voluntary offering of information. Can we do the cakewalk? Ethan asked, turning to his father. Absolutely. Robert took the wagon handle. Lead the way, buddy. As they followed Ethan through the crowd, Mrs. Belmont, the PTA president and a longtime friend of Jennifer's, intercepted them. Robert, so good to see you back. Her gaze slid to Laura with undisguised interest. And who's this? Laura Chen, a friend. Robert kept his introduction simple. Lovely to meet you. Mrs. Belmont's smile didn't reach her eyes. You know, Robert, Jennifer's parents called me last week. They're coming to visit soon. The mention of his in-laws tightened something in Robert's chest. Eleanor and Richard Morris had been devastated by their daughter's death. Their monthly visits were exercises in barely contained grief and thinly veiled criticism. The cakewalk began, children circling numbered squares while music played. When the music stopped, Ethan's face fell as another child won the prize. Better luck next round, buddy, Robert encouraged. Ethan shook his head. I don't want to play anymore. It was the kind of moment that would have spiraled into withdrawal before. Robert braced himself. Laura knelt beside Ethan. You know what? I'm terrible at cakewalks, too. Always have been. But I'm pretty good at the beanbag toss. Want to try that instead? Ethan considered this, then nodded. Crisis averted with such simple redirection. Robert marveled at how naturally it had happened. As they waited at the face painting station, Robert's phone rang. Eleanor Morris's name flashed on the screen. He silenced it, but Ethan stiffened beside him, the progress of the evening suddenly threatened. Laura noticed immediately. Hey, she said to Ethan, did I ever tell you I can make a paper frog that actually jumps? Maybe we can try that while you wait for your face paint. While she distracted Ethan, Robert stepped away to return the call. Eleanor's voice came through tight with emotion. Robert, we've been trying to reach you. Richard and I are flying in tomorrow. We want to spend time with Ethan. Eleanor, you usually give more notice. Robert kept his voice level. We have plans this weekend. What plans could be more important than Ethan spending time with his grandparents? And who is this woman you brought to the school event? Caroline Belmont says you introduced her as a friend. Really, Robert, it's only been 6 months since Jennifer. This isn't about Jennifer, Robert cut in. This is about what's best for Ethan right now. And you think you know what that is better than his own grandparents? Better than what his mother would have wanted? The invocation of Jennifer's wishes was a familiar weapon. I have to go, Eleanor. We'll discuss your visit when you arrive tomorrow. He ended the call and rejoined Ethan, who now sported a lightning bolt on his cheek and was showing Laura how a paper frog could jump from his palm. Everything okay? Laura asked. Jennifer's parents are arriving tomorrow, unannounced. Can Laura come over tomorrow? Ethan asked suddenly. To help with my pumpkin carving? The question hung in the air between them. I don't think tomorrow would be good, buddy, Robert said gently. Grandma and Grandpa are coming to visit. Ethan's face fell. But they don't like pumpkin carving, and they make you sad. The simple observation landed like a physical blow. Children saw more than adults gave them credit for. Maybe another time, Laura suggested. Pumpkins keep for a while. Ethan looked between them, then nodded with resignation that seemed too adult for his 7 years. As they walked toward the parking lot, Ethan's hand slipped into Laura's with the easy trust of childhood. She glanced at Robert, a question in her eyes. He nodded slightly. It was okay. Thank you for coming, he said as they reached his car. It meant a lot to him. It meant a lot to me, too. Laura knelt to say goodbye to Ethan. I liked your pumpkin and your lightning bolt. Very cool choices. Ethan surprised them both by wrapping his arms around her neck in a quick hug. Bye, Laura. Robert watched something complicated pass over her face. Joy, pain, longing, before she carefully hugged him back. Bye, Ethan. See you next Thursday for dinosaur pancakes. Ethan nodded, then climbed into the car without prompting. The in-laws, Robert said quietly. They're going to be difficult about this. He gestured vaguely between them. About a waitress being friends with their grandson? Laura's smile held no bitterness, only understanding. About anyone playing a role in Ethan's life that they think should be exclusively theirs, or Jennifer's. Eleanor and Richard Morris arrived at precisely 10 a.m. the next morning. Eleanor embraced Ethan with the desperate intensity that always made him withdraw, while Richard shook Robert's hand with formal stiffness. He's too thin, Eleanor pronounced, holding Ethan at arm's length. Aren't you feeding him properly, Robert? I eat dinosaur pancakes, Ethan said quietly. On Thursdays. Eleanor's perfectly coiffed silver hair caught the light as she turned to Robert. Pancakes for dinner? Really? When Ethan had gone to set up his pumpkin, Eleanor's pleasant facade dropped. Caroline Belmont told me about your waitress friend. Honestly, Robert, what are you thinking? Laura is someone Ethan trusts. That's rare these days. Trust? Richard spoke for the first time. He's 7. He doesn't know what's good for him. He needs family now, not strangers. He needs people who help him feel safe and heard. Laura has been that for him. And what exactly is your relationship with this woman? Eleanor's tone made the question an accusation. She's a friend, someone who's experienced similar loss. Similar loss? Did she lose a spouse as well? Robert hesitated. A child, her daughter. Eleanor's expression softened momentarily before hardening again. That's tragic, of course, but it doesn't qualify her to help raise our Jennifer's son. The day progressed with tense conversation and Eleanor's thinly veiled critiques. When Ethan refused to change out of his favorite dinosaur t-shirt for lunch at the country club, Eleanor's patience frayed. Ethan, sweetheart, nice boys don't wear the same shirt 2 days in a row, she said, her smile tight. Let's find something else in your closet. I like this one, Ethan insisted, arms crossed over the faded triceratops on his chest. Ethan. Her voice took on the edge that usually preceded tears. Please do this for Grandma. I brought you a nice sweater all the way from Boston. Eleanor, it's just lunch. The shirt is fine. It is not fine. Jennifer always dressed him properly. She stopped abruptly, closing her eyes. I'm sorry, I just want things to be nice, like she would have wanted. Ethan looked between the adults, his body tense. I need to use the bathroom, he announced, slipping away. 5 minutes passed, then 10. When Ethan didn't return, Robert went to check on him. The bathroom was empty. So was Ethan's bedroom. The back door stood slightly ajar, and in the kitchen, the pumpkin and carving tools were gone. Ethan, Robert called, stepping into the backyard. Instinct told him Ethan hadn't simply retreated to his treehouse. Eleanor appeared behind him. Where is he? What's happened? I don't know. The first tendrils of fear curled in Robert's stomach. He's upset. He's taken his pumpkin. Robert was already pulling out his phone. Laura answered on the third ring. Is Ethan with you? He asked without preamble. Her pause told him everything. Yes, he showed up at my apartment about 15 minutes ago. I was just about to call you. Relief flooded through him. How did he get there? He said he took the bus. The 40-second stops at the end of your street and passes right by my building. She lowered her voice. He's upset, Robert. Something about a shirt and his mom and grandma crying. His grandparents are here. There was a disagreement. I'll come get him. Of course, we're just setting up to carve his pumpkin. When he spoke to Ethan, the boy's voice was small. Dad? I'm sorry I left. Ethan, buddy, you can't just leave like that. You scared me. How did you know Laura's address? From when I was sick, I remembered. Pride colored his voice despite the circumstances. Are you mad? I'm not mad, but we need to talk about this. Grandma and Grandpa were worried too. Can Laura help with my pumpkin? She said she knows how to make the seeds yummy. The question highlighted the impossible position Robert found himself in. We'll talk about it when I get there. He ended the call to find Eleanor and Richard staring at him with identical expressions of disbelief. He ran away to this waitress. Eleanor's voice shook. This has gone too far, Robert. He ran to someone he trusts, Robert corrected. I need to go get him. We're coming with you, Richard declared. The drive to Laura's apartment was tense. When Laura opened her door, she was clearly prepared for Robert, but her eyes widened at the sight of the older couple behind him. Inside, Ethan sat at Laura's small kitchen table, newspaper spread beneath his pumpkin, a look of concentration on his face as he carefully drew a design with a marker. He glanced up, his expression falling when he saw his grandparents. Ethan James Harrington, Eleanor began, stepping forward. Do you have any idea how worried we were? Running off like that without telling anyone. Ethan shrank back in his chair. Laura moved subtly to stand near him, a protective gesture that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Eleanor, Robert warned, let me handle this. Richard surveyed the apartment, taking in the pumpkin seeds soaking in a bowl of water on the counter, the visible care that had been taken to make Ethan comfortable. So you're Laura, he said finally. Yes. She met his gaze directly. I apologize for the situation. I called Robert immediately when Ethan arrived. After letting a 7-year-old boy ride public transportation alone, Eleanor cut in. I didn't know he was coming, Laura replied calmly. But I'm glad he felt he could come here if he was upset. Robert knelt beside Ethan's chair. Buddy, you can't leave the house without telling me. Even if you're upset, it's not safe. I just wanted to carve my pumpkin, Ethan said, his voice small. And Laura knows how. She said we could make the seeds taste good with cinnamon. The mention of cinnamon caused Eleanor to flinch visibly. Cinnamon was Jennifer's signature spice, she said stiffly. She always made Ethan cinnamon toast when he was upset. Laura's expression softened with understanding. I didn't know. It was just something my daughter liked. Laura lost her daughter, Robert explained quietly. 3 years ago. Eleanor's expression faltered, maternal empathy momentarily overriding her hostility. I'm sorry for your loss, she said, the words formal but sincere. Richard cleared his throat. Regardless, Ethan belongs with family right now. We should go. Ethan's fingers tightened around his marker. But my pumpkin... We can work on it at home, Eleanor said firmly. It won't be the same. Ethan's voice rose, a rare display of emotion. Laura knows how to make it right. The outburst hung in the air. Robert saw the familiar signs of Ethan retreating, the way his shoulders curved inward, his gaze dropping to the floor. Why don't we all stay? The suggestion came from Laura, her voice calm despite the tension. Just for an hour, to carve the pumpkin together, then Ethan can go home with his family. Robert looked at her gratefully, then turned to his in-laws. 1 hour, for Ethan. Eleanor and Richard exchanged glances. Finally, Richard gave a tight nod. 1 hour. What followed was perhaps the most awkward pumpkin carving in history. Laura provided aprons for everyone and showed Ethan how to scoop out the seeds properly. Eleanor sat stiffly, while Richard reluctantly held the pumpkin steady. Gradually, something shifted in the room. When Laura rinsed the seeds and showed Ethan how to pat them dry, Eleanor moved closer. Jennifer always added a touch of nutmeg with the cinnamon, she said quietly. It was her mother's recipe. Laura nodded. That would add a nice warmth. Would you like to show us? It was a simple olive branch, but Eleanor took it, stepping to the counter to help season the seeds. Richard remained reserved, but Robert noticed how intently he watched Ethan. As the pumpkin took shape, a slightly lopsided face with a lightning bolt scar, Ethan grew more animated, explaining his design decisions to anyone who would listen. It was the most he'd spoken at one time since Jennifer's death. When the oven timer dinged for the seeds, Laura retrieved the tray, the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg filling the small apartment. They need to cool, she told Ethan. Like Mum's cookies, he said simply. Eleanor's sharp intake of breath was audible. She turned away, shoulders trembling slightly. Richard placed a steadying hand on her back. Why don't we light the pumpkin? Laura suggested. She found a small candle, and Robert helped Ethan place it inside. When they turned off the lights, the pumpkin glowed with warm, flickering light. Ethan's expression was transfixed by the soft orange glow. It's perfect, he whispered. In that moment, Robert understood something crucial. Ethan wasn't looking for a replacement for Jennifer. He was searching for ways to carry her with him, through cinnamon scents and small traditions, and people who made him feel as safe as she once had. When it was time to leave, Ethan carefully placed the pumpkin in the cardboard box Laura provided, adding a small bag of cooled cinnamon seeds. Thank you, he said to her, the words carrying weight beyond his years. Laura knelt to his level. You're welcome, Ethan. Thank you for sharing your pumpkin with me. Eleanor and Richard waited by the door, their earlier anger softened. As Robert helped Ethan with his jacket, Laura approached them. Mr. and Mrs. Morris, she said quietly, I never intended to insert myself into Ethan's life, but Ethan needs all of us right now, in different ways. Eleanor studied Laura's face for a long moment. You're not what I expected, she finally said. Mum would have liked her, Ethan said suddenly, his voice clear and certain. She helps people feel better, like Mom did. The simple observation silenced everyone. As they left, Laura stood in her doorway, a solitary figure framed by the warm light from within. Later, after Ethan was asleep, Robert found Eleanor sitting alone in the kitchen. She lost a child, Eleanor said without preamble. That waitress, Laura. Yes, her daughter. Is that why Ethan is drawn to her? Because she understands? Partly, but it's more than that. She sees him, Eleanor, not as Jennifer's son or as a problem to solve, just as Ethan. Eleanor traced the rim of her teacup. We failed today. Richard and I, we pushed too hard. We're all just trying to hold on to pieces of Jennifer, Ethan most of all. The Morrises extended their visit by 2 days. On their last morning, Eleanor pulled Robert aside. That woman, Laura, she's good for Ethan, I can see that now. Coming from Eleanor, this was monumental. Thank you for saying that. Jennifer would want him to be happy, to have people who care about him, even if they're not who we expected. At the diner the following Thursday, Laura greeted them with her usual smile. The usual today? She asked. Actually, Robert said, we were hoping you might join us when your shift ends. Laura's surprise was evident. Join you? And maybe to help plan Ethan's birthday party next month. The invitation hung between them, not romantic, not yet, but something equally significant, an acknowledgement of her place in their lives. Laura's gaze moved to Ethan, who was watching her with hopeful eyes. I'd like that, she said, finally. Very much. As she walked away, Ethan began arranging the sugar packets in the caddy, a habit that once signaled his retreat from the world. But this time, he was organizing them into a pattern, a simple house shape. What are you building, buddy? Robert asked. Ethan considered the arrangement thoughtfully. A home, he said, for all of us. 3 months later, Laura knelt beside a small stone marker in the memorial garden at Mercy Hospital, placing a paper crane on the smooth surface. Hey, Sophie, I brought you a new one. Ethan helped me fold it. Robert waited respectfully with Ethan by the path. Laura touched the engraved name before rising and walking back to them. Thank you for coming with me today. Together they walked to the car, Ethan between them, occasionally reaching for Laura's hand as well as his father's. The boy still had quiet days, times when grief settled over him like a heavy blanket, but those days were becoming less frequent. At the hospital cafe, Ethan asked, Dad, can we get cinnamon in our hot chocolate? Absolutely, Robert answered, his hand finding Laura's briefly. Cinnamon makes everything better. They weren't a conventional family, not yet, perhaps not ever in the traditional sense, but they had built something real, something that honored what was lost while making space for what remained, something that felt, finally, like healing. For now, that was enough. Don't forget to like this video if you believe in the power of love to break down walls and bridge any divide. Please do comment your feedback and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of family, redemption, and the triumph of love over pride. Remember, it's never too late to change your story.